Thanks, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. It's exciting times for enhanced weathering, and what I want to do in my talk really is to um, go through some of the scientific basis for how we go about quantifying the amount of carbon dioxide removal that can be achieved via enhanced weathering. Also, to reflect a little on some of those field trials that I've been involved in and identify what are the outstanding issues and how we can go about bettering those. And then I hope that segues quite nicely into Isometric's talk on what they're doing in terms of their carbon registry. So David's been through all this already, but I just want to reflect a little on how carbon dioxide is removed via enhanced weathering. So we apply the crushed silicate rock usually to our agricultural crops that reacts with rainwater that contains carbon dioxide within it. And that dissolves the rock, and the weathering products are, in this case, calcium ions, so base cations, hydrogen carbonate ions. So we're converting the carbon dioxide into hydrogen carbonate ions. And in this case, we're also producing dissolved silicon that goes into plants and soils as well. So just taking this equation then, I want to think about, well, how do we then calculate how much carbon has been removed on the basis of this equation, or using this equation as an example. So first of all, what we can do is we can monitor the increase in hydrogen carbonate ions or alkalinity in the soil water. So we can focus on the products of the reaction. We can also monitor the loss of the mobile cations, so they're the base cations, from the rock that we apply. And then the other thing we can do, of course, is to look at how much carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere as it crosses the air to soil interface. So I just want to take each one of those and think about how those approaches have actually been applied in weathering studies, natural weathering studies, for many years. So in terms of calculating carbon dioxide removal from the production of alkalinity, that's been used to quantify carbon dioxide removal rates via weathering for many decades. So this is the classic paper here, published back in 1999 from Jérôme Galladay and colleagues in France. And what they do is they analysed the hydrogen carbonate ion content of stream waters all over the globe. They quantified the discharge of those stream waters, and they were able to turn that into a carbon dioxide consumption rate. So you can see on this plot here that carbon dioxide consumption flux from weathering of silicate rocks, as we might expect, is linearly related to the weathering flux that we see in those streams. So this approach is really well grounded in science that's been used for many years. Key things about this approach, though, is, of course, it does integrate over an entire catchment area. We generally don't work at catchment scales, at least at the moment. Obviously, as things scale up, we will be in enhanced rock weathering studies. And working at the catchment scale has some advantages because many of the world's largest rivers are instrumented. And so they do have continuous discharge records, so we can quantify the water flux. But that water flux can also be estimated from records of rainfall and evapotranspiration. So that's kind of covered off quite nicely. In terms of the alkalinity measurements themselves, they're generally not continuous. But there are many models and studies of what we call load estimation. These generally arrive from things like looking at nutrient fluxes to rivers and to the ocean as well. So there are ways of interpolating and extrapolating those data. The advantages of doing this are it does enable us to distinguish between weathering of silicate rocks and carbonate rocks if they happen to be in the applied rock material. And it allows us to quantify any contributions from strong acid weathering. So that's from sulfuric acid or nitric acid. Of course, when we're working in natural systems, generally we're not too bothered about nitric acid because fertilizers are not applied. But of course, and this was one of the questions that came before, this can be important in catchments draining sulfides. So we can look at the sulfate content of the stream waters and make a correction for that. So that's all really useful from a carbon dioxide accounting point of view. Okay, moving on to the second method now, and now we're looking at the soils themselves and the products of weathering, what's left in the soils after weathering has happened. So what we can do is we can look at the loss of mobile cations, and we normalize that to immobile cations in the soil. And that allows us to differentiate, for example, between different sources of material. And that's been used in rock weathering studies for many decades. And there are various well-established methods such as the chemical index of alteration, which I show on the right-hand side here, which is simply the ratio of the immobile cations, in this case, aluminium, to the total cation, so the immobile plus the cations that will be weathered, so the calcium, the sodium, and potassium in this case. And you can set up, you can do these calculations, and where we have high values for chemical index of alteration, we've got a lot of weathering going on or high weathering intensity, and where it's low, we see very little. And you can see the red arrows here show different pathways for that weathering process. And because we are dealing with nickel, I thought I would show some work from one of my PhD students who looked at a nickel laterite deposit in Brazil. And we have the unaltered bedrock down in blue at the bottom here. And then as we move up the soil profile, it becomes increasingly altered. And you can see that our index of alteration is increasing as we get increased weathering. And the question then is, how do we turn that into carbon dioxide removal? Well, we can do that if we assume that the loss of those mobile cations that we calculate in this way is balanced by an increase in hydrogen carbonate or alkalinity, and we can use that to calculate carbon dioxide removal. Okay, final technique, I talked about quantifying uptake of carbon dioxide into the soil. Measuring fluxes of carbon dioxide across the air-soil interface is widely used to assess soil respiration rates. And that's the principal driver of exchange across the soil-air interface. But weathering, of course, will play a role. It's usually a subordinate role. But what we can do is look at the ratio of carbon dioxide to oxygen to distinguish between carbon dioxide fluxes attributed to weathering versus those that are attributed to soil respiration. So how do we do that? We can use, on the right-hand side here, at small scale, we can use these flux chambers, and over larger scales, we can use eddy covariance flux towers to quantify carbon dioxide exchange. The issues with this are that soil respiration dominates the carbon dioxide flux, and those respiration fluxes are incredibly variable. So you can just see in this middle plot here, over the course of a couple of weeks here, we've got enormous amounts of variability in there. So distinguishing a relatively small signal due to weathering from this very variable background flux is going to be challenging. And studies have looked at this to figure out whether we can see how soil respiration rates are changing in a changing climate. And basically, these calculations indicate in red here It gives us the years of observations where we cannot say that there is a significant change in soil respiration rates, and it doesn't become significant until more than 100 years worth of observations are required in order to give us confidence because of that background variability. So this is a challenge, and I'm going to ignore it in the rest of my presentation. All right, so how do we go about using those two techniques I just talked about? How do we go about applying those to enhance weathering? So just some general considerations, first of all. Key thing is obviously we need to isolate the effect of the feedstock that we apply from the background natural weathering processes that would go on in any case. So we need to demonstrate additionality. Most of the time, our approach towards this has been to establish a baseline or control plots that can be analysed alongside plots where we do apply the feedstock to. So this is just a small example from a small scale experiment we conducted on a farm in Norfolk here. And you can see we have control plots in yellow and plots to which we applied our basalt treatment in red. And that's generally effective, but of course those control plots need to be representative of what is going on in the plots to which we apply the feedstock. We also, as I already alluded to, we need to overcome fairly large scale spatial and temporal heterogeneities that we experience in these agricultural systems. And the other thing is, I come from a background of looking at natural weathering processes. And what I would say about croplands is they are not remotely natural. Okay, there's an awful lot of agricultural practices that go on. They add fertilizers, they plow, they grow plants, they harvest those plants. And that means that the baseline is effectively always shifting, and we need to be able to account for that. And of course, we're also dealing with a multi-component system. We're not just dealing with weathering of soils and weathering of applied feedstock. We're dealing with adding fertilizers, removing crops, all this kind of thing. So it's a pretty challenging problem. Next difficulty we need to overcome is thinking about what are our system boundaries. As I mentioned before, when we're looking at carbon dioxide removal via alkalinity fluxes, we're working at a catchment scale. So they're lovely, they're integrated. We can continuously monitor things, but actually, from an MRV point of view, we're not going to be able to work at those sorts of levels. So we need to figure out, for example, on this diagram on the right-hand side here, are we just going to sample the soil water in the region to which we apply the feedstock? Are we going to do it at the base, at the bedrock, or the groundwaters that David just alluded to? Where are we going to do this? Or actually, where are we happy that CO2 has not just been captured, but has been stored? Do we actually then need to go to the rivers, to the ocean? So thinking about the system boundaries is tricky. And then finally, we need to, obviously, key to this is we need to be robust, okay? Because ultimately we're dealing in a system where we would like to move towards carbon crediting. And so you need to be robust, because what we absolutely have to do is avoid accusations of greenwashing. But we also need to be affordable, okay? Because enhanced weathering is only going to be an effective carbon dioxide removal technique if it's delivered at scale. And if it's delivered at scale, that's going to be done commercially, not by my boutique lab laboratory at a university. Okay, so I wanted to just think now about what we have learned from field trials so far. So I wanted to start with thinking about calculating carbon dioxide removal from alkalinity fluxes. And in terms of looking at soil discharge water, so I'm thinking about stream waters here, To date, there are very few studies on alkalinity fluxes in stream waters. But a field trial that was conducted in by the Leverhulme Centre for Climate Change Mitigation, involving myself and Christina Larkin, did look at those waters. And basically, the treated plots are the orange ones here, and the controls are the blue. Any uplift that we see in carbon dioxide removal due to enhanced weathering is pretty muted. It's on the order of a few percent. If we move to looking at shallow soil waters, so sort of 0 to 30 centimeters depth, the depth to which you may apply your rocks, we generally see a higher response, up to sort of 50% or so. So these are some unpublished data from a field trial that we're doing in the UK. So what's pretty clear then is that there is effectively loss of that alkalinity through the soil profile. And why is this? Well, there are two principal ways this alkalinity can be lost. Firstly, through secondary mineral formation, so formation of clays or carbonate, and that's permanent loss of the alkalinity flux. But also through soil cation exchange. And I'll talk about that in just a sec, but that's actually a transient loss. So what is soil cation exchange? Well, as many soil scientists have known for many, many years, weathering products or base cations can get taken up onto soil cation exchange sites. So the diagram on the right here shows, for example, calcium being released from our applied calcium silicate feedstock, being exchanged for hydrogen ions on the soil surface. Those hydrogen ions need to be charge balanced, so they combine with the bicarbonate and produce CO2. But ultimately, over time, the calcium ions will come back off again and re-react with the CO2 and generate alkalinity. So what this essentially does is generate a time lag. Question is, what is that time lag? And that's really poorly constrained at the moment. It's going to be a function of soil cation exchange capacity, the percent base saturation, water flux, pH, and those sorts of parameters. On the right here, there's just a model where we're looking at calcium that's being taken up onto exchange sites. You can see almost 100% of the calcium that's weathered is taken up in the early part of the process. But then ultimately that calcium is coming off. And all of it will ultimately be re-released. So we return to 100% of the carbon dioxide removal that we would have started with. And the proportion of base cations taken up can at least initially be very high. You can see that from this diagram here, that most of those weathered cations are ending up on the soil exchangeable sites. And of course, in Brazil, where you have low pH soils, low base cation exchange capacity, this is going to be a serious issue. The other thing we need to think about is dealing with spatial and temporal heterogeneity. At the catchment scale, if those catchments are instrumented and there's a regular sampling program, that's less of an issue, but that's generally not the case and won't be the case in enhanced water weathering studies. And there's a chance that we miss capturing the full story about carbon dioxide removal, because normally it's large flushing events that are missed because nobody likes going out and sampling in the rain. As yet, there are a few trials at the catchment scale, so we rely on analysis of soil waters. The question then is, well, what depth do we then store them? What are downstream losses when we get out of the soil profile? The spatial and temporal heterogeneity in those soil waters can be very large, and the quantification of the water flux is generally indirect, although you can get weighing lysimeters. So one thing we can do though, and I think this is quite an exciting advance, is that now we have these sort of self-integrating accumulators, which are essentially ion exchange resins that can be implanted in the soil and capture all the cations running down them, so you can install them at different depths, for example. And you know that could be something that really helps out the enhanced weathering community moving forward. Okay, deriving carbon dioxide removal from the analysis of soils. So again, this is based on the established chemical index of alteration procedures that I talked about before. So we assume loss of mobile cations is balanced by the production of hydrogen carbonate. But one thing I would say is that this gives us essentially a carbon dioxide removal, but it will exclude any transient losses due to uh, it will include transient losses via soil exchange and secondary mineral formation to the sampling depth, but not beyond that. Doesn't quantify any strong acid dissolution or plant uptake. And then the other issue with this, there's a lovely paper and a lovely idea, but it's quite difficult to apply this in reality. First of all, you need to check the resolvability. You know, in enhanced rock weathering, we actually want to be minimizing the distance between the rock that we apply and where we apply it. But that maximizes your chances of the rock types being quite similar, which makes resolving what's coming from the feedstock versus what's coming from the soil quite difficult. So there's a recent paper here that shows if we get this is for 30% dissolution of our soil and different uncertainties. You know, we can be talking about pretty high feedstock application rates if we are going to actually be able to resolve these signals. And why is resolving these signals an issue? Well, these diagrams here look lovely. The theory looks great. But what we need to remember is that soils are hugely heterogeneous. And we see a black dot down here. It's not really like that. It's going to be more like a fuzzy ellipse like this. It's not simple to resolve. And the other thing is that, you know, in this diagram here, it looks like you've got a lot of feedstock relative to the soil. That's not the case, generally speaking. We're actually working at this end of the spectrum, right down here where this red blob is. So that makes resolving things tricky. And then finally, I spoke about this before, we have a moving baseline. In agricultural systems, the control soils are going to have to be resampled when the treatment soils are sampled to accommodate that. I just wanted to briefly mention, and David spoke about this as well, about carbon dioxide removal via accumulation of soil inorganic and organic carbon. I just wanted to make the point that very, very small changes in soil inorganic carbon or organic carbon actually equate to very large carbon dioxide removal if that's permanent. So, for example, if the soil and organic carbon content of topsoil increased by 0.1 weight% over 1 year, that's 14 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. So that's very, very large. And then the 4 per mil initiative, again, the idea behind this is that if we increase soil organic carbon by 0.4%, that's actually enough to capture all of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Precipitation of soil in organic carbon, though, is a tricky one because it can be spatially and temporally separate from where the weathering takes place. So it tends, David spoke about this, it tends to precipitate deeper in the soil profile, and it precipitates when soils are dry, but can redissolve when it's wet. So it may take decades to assess those changes reliably. Okay, I just want to finish up by talking about some of the knowledge gaps and future steps. First thing, when I put this talk together, I was thinking, oh, I feel like it's a bit pessimistic, but actually, I don't want to give that message at all. The message is, I think we've come a really, really long way from certainly where I started off 6 or 7 years ago now. But we do have key knowledge gaps. But the good thing is we kind of know what those knowledge gaps are now, whereas before we didn't know what they were. So we're definitely in a better place. So what we definitely need is a better technical understanding of the short-term and long-term biogeochemical processes that affect carbon flows from the soils, which is the cradle, to the grave, which ultimately is the oceans. We need a better understanding of those time lags that I talked about due to cation exchange, secondary mineral formation, stabilization or otherwise of soil organic carbon due to mineral complexation, effects of enhanced weathering on other greenhouse gas fluxes as well. Actually, it may suppress emissions of nitrous oxide, which would be a good thing. And then, of course, the downstream processes that affect carbon dioxide removal efficiency. I didn't really have time to touch on this, but there can be processes in rivers and streams and the oceans as well that will affect that. So what are the next steps then? I think that there's definitely a need for continuous long-term, large-scale instrumented field trials, of the order of 10 to 15 years or so. And also for co-deploying enhanced weathering with other carbon dioxide removal techniques, including things like afforestation or biochar. Of course, clear and transparent reporting of carbon dioxide removal is essential. I think there's an awful lot of confusion in the literature at the moment because people are reporting things in different ways. And different techniques measure different things. I just put together a quick example here from these numbers are not set in stone. This is initial work, but just to say the maximum carbon dioxide removal potential that the Remforth equation that David spoke about of a rock can be around sort of 9 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare. If we look at the soils measurements, it's generally a bit less. But if we actually go to the soil water measurements coming out the soil discharge waters, it's 2 orders of magnitude lower again. And it's not that any of these things are wrong, it's just that they're measuring different things. Okay, so the gap, for example, between here and here is principally due to cation uptake onto soil cation exchange sites. So that carbon dioxide removal will be realised, but just not at the same time the weathering happens. And of course, ultimately, we're going to need to go towards modelling. We can't have enormous sampling programs over the large scales needed for carbon dioxide removal. So we're going to need effective models for carbon flows across soils, groundwater, river systems, and the oceans for accurate CDR predictions. And they're really a long way off at the moment. Okay, so I want to end it there. Thank the various people here and a couple of shameless plugs to finish. This is the meeting that we're organising in November. Very happy for people to join us for that. Definitely invite you for that. And we have a paper that will be coming out shortly on challenges and opportunities for enhanced weathering as well. Okay, thank you. And if you have any questions, happy to take them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rachel. It's really informative and great presentation. And we do have several questions coming up from the audience. So I think the first one is, Francisco was asking, what is the currently most reliable and high quality indicator for detecting carbon sequestration in agricultural soil and why? So given all these different options you have discussed, which one do you think has the most potential in the future or most reliable?
The most direct measurement is obviously measuring the alkalinity directly in the waters. If we can get to catchment scale, that would be amazing because then we can properly scale things up. So that's certainly the most direct measurement. Having said that, it's not going to be it's not the easiest, and it does require fairly continuous sampling at high density. If you can get to the catchment scale, you effectively integrate over that catchment area. So those sorts of issues go away. There's certainly an argument for looking at the soils because farmers sample soils regularly all the time, right? Because they're looking at the sort of nutrient status and pH and things of those soils. So they're very familiar with taking those kind of measurements. We know from soil organic measurements of soil organic carbon, we know at sort of what sampling density we need to capture the heterogeneity. So yeah, I don't think I have I'm really sorry, but I don't think I have a silver bullet for you there. And also, I think that, and there's no single approach that can really answer those issues at the moment. So we sort of have to use our toolkits to. It's still a sort of a research question, but hopefully we can move things on. Things are moving on pretty quickly, and we can get more definitive answers to that.
Okay, great. Then the next question from Erica is about, is there any ERW or advanced geochemical courses online that offered by the presenter? That I'm assuming Erica wants to dive deep into the ERW
Oh,
stuff. Yeah,
uh, well, I do give some lectures on it to my third year students. I'm not sure how amazing they are, but Erica, certainly happy to send you my third year lectures, and you can also a practical where you can calculate enhanced weathering potentials of different rock types yourself.
great. So Erica, please contact Rachel and she will send you the materials you would love to know. Okay, and the next question we have, I think we don't have time for further question, but this will be the final one. So Yoshiki asked whether you could tell more about the co-development of EW projects with other CDR, like as you mentioned, biochar or so on.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously there's plenty of potential for adding crushed rock to along with biochar, along with forestry work. So there is a big project being undertaken in the UK by the what are they called? Carbon Forest Trust or something in Wales, where they are co-deploying silicate rocks from a local quarry with reforestation. So that sort of work is ongoing. I don't think that there's any work being done with biochar at the moment, or there may well be, because it's certainly starting to be discussed. So yeah, it's sort of stacking the different carbon dioxide removal technologies on top of one another, and hopefully for the benefit of all of them.